The city streets were quiet that night, with only the occasional flicker of streetlights breaking through the autumn fog. Officer Lee sat in her patrol car, watching steam rise from her third cup of coffee. The clock on her dashboard read 11:43 p.m., just about an hour left in her shift. She'd been on the force for 8 years now, and night shifts still hadn't gotten any easier. The radio crackled to life, interrupting her thoughts. Unit 247, we've got a noise complaint at Pine Grove Apartments. Building C, multiple residents reporting strange noises from Unit 4B, possible disturbance. Copy that, dispatch. Unit 247 responding, Lee replied, already turning her key in the ignition. As she pulled away from her usual parking spot behind the old grocery store, something felt different about this call. Maybe it was the way dispatch had said strange noises instead of the usual loud music or domestic disputes she handled most nights. The fog grew thicker as she drove through the sleeping neighborhoods. Pine Grove Apartments wasn't in the best part of town, but it wasn't in the worst either. It was one of those places where working families lived alongside elderly residents who'd been there for decades, all of them just trying to make it through another day. Lee remembered her own grandmother living in a similar complex after grandfather passed away. The thought brought back memories of weekly visits, the smell of homemade dumplings, and the loneliness she'd seen in her grandmother's eyes, despite their regular family gatherings. As she pulled into the apartment complex parking lot, her headlights swept across the worn but well-maintained buildings. A few windows still glowed with late-night television light, but most were dark. The security lights cast long shadows between the buildings, and somewhere in the distance, a cat yowled at the moon. She stepped out of her patrol car, adjusting her utility belt, a habit born from years of experience. The cool night air carried strange sounds, a scratching noise, definitely, and something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It wasn't the aggressive sound of a break-in or the chaos of a fight. This was different, almost like crying, but not quite human. The building's security lights flickered as she approached the main entrance, her boots making soft sounds on the damp pavement. An elderly resident was already waiting by the door, wrapped in a faded blue robe. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," the woman whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "Those sounds have been going on for hours. Mrs. Thompson up in 4B, we're worried about her. She hasn't been the same since." Lee nodded, pulling out her notepad. "Can you tell me more about Mrs. Thompson?" The woman wrung her hands, concern etched across her face. "She's lived here for over 30 years. Lost her husband last spring. Cancer took him quick. She used to be the heart of our little community here, always organizing holiday gatherings in the common room. But lately, the woman's voice trailed off, heavy with unspoken worry. As if on cue, another strange sound echoed through the building's hallway. A mix between a whimper and a scratch that sent chills down Lee's spine. She'd handled hundreds of calls in her career. Domestic disputes, break-ins, noise complaints about loud parties. But something about this one touched a deeper chord. "I'll head up and check on her," Lee assured the worried neighbor. "Have there been any other unusual activities, visitors, anything out of the ordinary?" The woman shook her head. "That's just it, dear. She hardly has any visitors anymore. Her children live out of state, and since Robert, that's her husband, passed away, she barely leaves the apartment. Sometimes I see her getting her mail, but that's about it." Lee made her way to the stairwell, her flashlight beam cutting through the dim hallway lighting. Each step seemed to bring those strange sounds closer. They were definitely coming from the 4th floor, and they were getting louder. What started as a routine noise complaint was quickly becoming something else entirely, something that would remind her why she'd chosen this profession in the first place. As she reached the 4th floor landing, she keyed her radio. "Dispatch, Unit 247. I'm on scene at Pine Grove, going to do a welfare check on the resident. Can you have another unit swing by, just in case?" "Copy that, 247. Unit 253 is in the area, ETA 5 minutes. Lee approached Unit 4B, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The scratching sounds were clearer now, accompanied by what definitely sounded like crying, but something about it wasn't quite right. She placed her hand on her holstered flashlight, not her weapon. Years of experience had taught her to read situations, and this one didn't feel dangerous, it felt sad. Standing before the worn apartment door, she took a deep breath. Sometimes the most important moments in police work weren't about enforcing laws or catching bad guys. Sometimes they were about being there for people during their darkest hours. As she raised her hand to knock, Lee had no idea that this call would become one of those moments, one that would remind her why she put on the badge every day, one that would leave not just her, but an entire community forever changed. As Officer Lee guided her patrol car through the misty streets, memories from 6 months ago began flooding back. The familiar brick buildings of Pine Grove Apartments emerged from the fog, their weathered facade telling stories of countless lives lived within these walls. Her cruiser's headlights caught the reflecting numbers on Building C, and her heart grew heavy. "I know this place," she whispered to herself, turning off the engine. "I know it too well." The spring evening from 6 months ago played back in her mind like an old movie. It had been warmer then, with cherry blossoms scattered across the parking lot. The call that night had been different. Desperate neighbors reporting screams from Unit 4B. She remembered running up those same stairs, her heart pounding, expecting the worst. Instead, she'd found heartbreak of a different kind. Mrs. Thompson, Barbara, had been sitting in the middle of her living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and old photographs. The screaming the neighbors heard wasn't from violence, it was from grief. Raw, uncontrolled grief that could only come from losing your other half after 50 years together. Lee remembered how Barbara had clutched her husband's old cardigan that night, her small frame shaking with sobs. "I found his reading glasses behind the couch," she had said, her voice barely a whisper. "He must have dropped them there the week before. She couldn't finish the sentence. That night, Lee had stayed well past her shift. She'd sat on the floor with Barbara, looking through old photo albums. Pictures of a young couple in the 1970s, full of dreams and love. Snapshots of family picnics, Christmas mornings, and quiet moments on their back porch. Robert Thompson's smile was the same in every photo, kind, gentle, reaching all the way to his eyes. He never liked hospitals, Barbara had shared, touching a photo of them at their daughter's college graduation. But he didn't complain, not once. Even when the pain was at its worst, he'd just hold my hand and tell me stories about when we first met. Can you believe he remembered the color of the dress I wore on our first date? 50 years later, and he still remembered it was yellow with tiny white daisies. Now, as Lee stepped out of her patrol car, those memories made the current call even more concerning. The strange noises reported by the neighbors, what new chapter of grief was unfolding in Unit 4B? A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying the sound of distant traffic and something else, that peculiar mix of scratching and whimpering that had prompted tonight's call. Lee adjusted her badge, a habit she developed over years of service. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness as she made her way to the building's entrance. The security light above the door flickered, moths dancing in its glow. Lee remembered how Barbara had told her about Robert changing that same bulb every spring and fall like clockwork. He always said good lighting made people feel safer, Barbara had explained. He cared about things like that, making sure everyone in the building felt secure. As she reached for the door handle, Lee caught her reflection in the glass. 8 years on the force had taught her that some calls changed you, stayed with you. That spring night with Barbara Thompson had been one of them. It had reminded her that behind every door, every window, there were stories, lives being lived, grief being shouldered, memories being made and mourned. The lobby was quiet except for the hum of the old heating system. Mrs. Peters from Unit 1A poked her head out, still in her flowered nightgown. "Officer, is that you? Have you come about the noises?" Lee nodded, keeping her voice low. "Yes, ma'am. Can you tell me how long they've been going on?" "Started around sunset," Mrs. Peters whispered, wringing her hands. "At first, we thought nothing of it. But then, well, you remember what happened with Barbara after Robert passed. We're worried she might be having another rough spell. She's been different lately. Not bad different, just different. Last week, I saw her smiling at the mailbox. First time I'd seen that since Robert." Lee made a note in her small notebook, the pages illuminated by the lobby's fluorescent lights. The scratching sound echoed down the stairwell, followed by what almost sounded like a whine. Not human, definitely not human, but somehow familiar. Her radio crackled softly. Unit 247, backup is 2 minutes out. Do you need immediate assistance? Negative, dispatch. Stand by, Lee responded, her eyes drawn to the stairs. Something about this didn't feel threatening. It felt like another piece of Barbara Thompson's story was about to unfold. As she began climbing the stairs to the 4th floor, Lee thought about all the calls she'd responded to over the years. Some were routine, some were dangerous, but some, like that night 6 months ago, reminded her why she'd become a police officer. It wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about being there for people during their darkest moments, and sometimes, if you were lucky, being there to see the light start to return. The scratching grew louder with each step. Whatever she was about to find in Unit 4B, Lee silently promised herself she'd handle it with the same care and compassion she'd shown 6 months ago. Sometimes that's what people needed most, not just an officer of the law, but a fellow human being who understood that healing takes many forms and that grief, like love, rarely follows a predictable path. Officer Lee's footsteps echoed in the stairwell as she climbed to the 4th floor. Her backup, Officer Wilson, waited in the lobby below, ready to respond if needed. The building's old heating pipes creaked and groaned, adding to the strange symphony of sounds that filled the night air. At the 4th floor landing, she paused, listening. The scratching noise was clearer now, rhythmic, persistent, coming from behind the one door of Unit 4B. Between the scratches came that whimpering sound again, muffled but distinct. Something about it tugged at her heart, different from the sounds of human distress she'd encountered countless times before. The hallway was dimly lit, with shadows dancing on the walls from the flickering fluorescent light at the far end. Family photos and seasonal decorations adorned the neighboring doors, little touches that made this building more than just another apartment complex. But Unit 4B's door stood bare, its peephole like a watchful eye in the darkness. Lee approached carefully, her shoes silent on the thin carpet. The last time she'd stood here, the door had been covered with sympathy cards. Now, only faint outlines remained where tape had pulled away at the paint. She raised her hand and knocked firmly. Mrs. Thompson, this is Officer Lee from the police department. Are you all right in there? Silence answered her, broken only by another scratch and whimper. She knocked again, louder this time. Mrs. Thompson, please open the door if you can hear me. We're concerned about your safety. The scratching stopped momentarily, then resumed with greater intensity. Lee pressed her ear to the door, trying to make sense of the sounds. There was movement inside, shuffling, something being dragged or moved across the floor. Her radio crackled softly. Unit 247, status check. Still investigating, she responded quietly. No response from the resident yet. Lee thought about Barbara Thompson's face from 6 months ago, tear-stained and lost in grief. She thought about the photos she'd seen that night, a lifetime of love captured in fading snapshots. Something wasn't adding up. The sounds weren't angry or threatening, they held a different kind of urgency. She tried one more time. Mrs. Thompson, if you don't respond, I'll need to use the building master key to check on you. I just want to make sure you're safe. More shuffling sounds, but still no answer. Lee pulled out the master key the building manager had provided for emergencies. As she inserted it into the lock, she remembered Barbara's words from their last encounter. The hardest part isn't the big moments, it's the little things. Coming home to an empty apartment, cooking for one, nobody to tell about your day. The key turned with a heavy click. Lee announced herself one final time before slowly pushing the door open, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the apartment. The air inside was warm and carried an unfamiliar scent, not the musty smell of neglect she sometimes encountered in welfare checks, but something different. Mrs. Thompson, she called out softly, scanning the entrance area. The living room came into view, looking different from her last visit. The moving boxes were gone, replaced by neat stacks of photo albums on the coffee table. A half-drunk cup of tea sat nearby, still warm. The scratching grew louder, coming from deeper within the apartment. Lee moved carefully through the living room, noting small changes that sparked hope rather than concern. Fresh flowers in a vase by the window. A magazine opened to a dog-eared page, signs of life, not abandonment. Her beam caught movement down the hallway, a shadow passing under the bedroom door. The whimpering was clearer now, accompanied by what sounded like rustling fabric. Lee's hand moved instinctively to her radio, but something held her back. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, they were telling her this wasn't a situation that called for backup. She reached the bedroom door, noticing how the sounds had changed. The scratching had stopped, replaced by something that almost sounded like panting. Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from growing curiosity. What would she find on the other side of this door? Mrs. Thompson. She called out one more time, her hand on the doorknob. "I'm coming in now." As she began to turn the handle, Lee thought about all the doors she'd opened in her career, some leading to danger, others to heartbreak, and occasionally to moments that reminded her why she wore the badge. Something told her this door would lead to the ladder, but even her years of experience couldn't have prepared her for what she was about to discover. The bedroom door creaked open, and in that moment, everything about this strange call began to make sense. The scratching, the whimpering, the mysterious changes in Barbara Thompson's behavior, it all connected in a way that would bring tears to her eyes and remind her that sometimes the best endings come from the most unexpected beginnings. The bedroom door swung open slowly, its hinges creaking in the silence. Officer Lee's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that made her catch her breath. The room was bathed in soft moonlight streaming through partially opened curtains, illuminating dozens of photographs scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. In the center of this sea of memories knelt Mrs. Thompson, still in her day clothes despite the late hour. Her silver hair caught the moonlight, creating a gentle halo around her tear-streaked face. But these weren't tears of despair. Something about her expression was different from that grief-stricken night 6 months ago. "Oh, officer," Mrs. Thompson said softly, not even startled by the intrusion. "I should have answered the door. I couldn't leave him alone." That's when Lee heard it again, the whimpering. Her flashlight beam followed the sound, and there, beneath the bed, 2 eyes reflected back at her. Young eyes, frightened eyes. The mystery of the strange noises suddenly began to make sense. Lee crouched down slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Tucked partially under the bed was a German Shepherd puppy, no more than 3 months old, its small body tangled in what appeared to be an old piece of clothing. As her light fell on it, the puppy let out another whimper, followed by those scratching sounds that had prompted the neighbor's calls. "He found Robert's old sweater in one of the boxes," Mrs. Thompson explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was going through some things, you see, finally feeling strong enough to sort through Robert's clothes, and this little one he pulled it out and wouldn't let go, just like Robert used to do with his favorite sweater after work." Lee holstered her flashlight and knelt beside the elderly woman, taking in the full scene. The puppy had somehow wrapped itself in a well-worn brown cardigan, the same one she remembered Mrs. Thompson clutching during that difficult night months ago. But now, that piece of clothing wasn't just a painful reminder of loss. It had become a bridge between past and present. "I couldn't bear to untangle him," Mrs. Thompson continued, reaching out to stroke the puppy's ear. "He just looked so peaceful, despite being stuck. Reminded me of how Robert would get himself tangled in his fishing line every summer at the lake." She laughed softly, the sound carrying a warmth that had been absent from this room for too long. The puppy, sensing the change in attention, wiggled closer to the edge of the bed, still dragging the sweater with him. His tail, barely visible beneath the fabric, began to wag hopefully. Lee noticed how his fur was the same rich brown color as the man smiling from the photographs scattered around them, photos of a younger Robert Thompson with another German Shepherd taken decades ago. "His name was Rex," Mrs. Thompson said, picking up one of the photos. "Our first dog, right after we got married. Robert always said Rex helped build our family before the kids came along. We had him for 13 wonderful years." She paused, touching the image gently. "I never thought I'd have another dog, not after Robert, but this little one, he chose you," Lee finished softly, understanding flooding her heart. She'd seen many things in her years on the force, but moments like this, moments of healing and hope, these were the ones that reminded her why she loved her job. The puppy had finally managed to squirm free of the sweater, bounding over to Mrs. Thompson with clumsy enthusiasm. His paws scattered the photographs further, but she didn't seem to mind. Instead, she laughed, a real, genuine laugh that seemed to chase away the last shadows of grief from the room's corners. "I adopted him yesterday," she explained, trying to contain the excited puppy in her lap. "The shelter was having an adoption event. I'd only went to donate some old blankets, I swear. But then this little troublemaker spotted Robert's photo in my wallet when I was getting my ID out. He started whining and pawing at it, just like he's doing with the sweater now." The shelter staff said they'd never seen him react to anyone that way. Lee watched as the puppy showered Mrs. Thompson's face with tiny kisses, his whole body wiggling with joy. The contrast between this scene and her last visit to this bedroom was striking. Where there had been only silence and tears, now there was life and laughter. "I was worried about the neighbors hearing him cry," Mrs. Thompson admitted, her face growing concerned. "He gets anxious at night, all alone in a new place. I've been sitting up with him, showing him old photos, telling him stories about Robert and Rex. Probably sounds silly." "It doesn't sound silly at all," Lee assured her, reaching out to scratch the puppy's chin. "Sometimes the best healing comes from unexpected places, or in this case, unexpected paws." The puppy responded by flopping onto his back, proudly displaying his belly for rubs. His antics sent several more photos sliding across the floor, including one that caught Lee's eye, and young Robert Thompson throwing a stick for Rex on a sunny beach, his smile as bright as the summer day around him. The bedroom felt quiet except for the gentle panting of the puppy, who had finally settled down in Mrs. Thompson's lap. Officer Lee sat cross-legged on the carpet, surrounded by scattered photographs, watching as the elderly woman gathered her courage to share her story. "You know," Mrs. Thompson began, absently stroking the puppy's ears, "I hadn't left this apartment for anything except groceries and doctor visits since Robert passed. My children, they call every week, bless their hearts, kept telling me to get out more. But where do you go when half of you is missing?" She reached for a tissue from the bedside table, dabbing at her eyes. The puppy immediately sat up, placing one paw on her arm as if trying to comfort her. This simple gesture brought a wobbly smile to her face. "Yesterday morning, I was cleaning out the whole closet. Found an old box of Rex's things that Robert had kept all these years, his collar, some old tennis balls, even his favorite blanket. I decided to donate them to the local shelter. Thought maybe they could help some other dog while I was waiting to see Robert again." The puppy squirmed in her lap, trying to reach her face with his tongue. His clumsy attempts at comfort made both women smile. The shelter was so busy, they were having some kind of adoption event. All these families looking for pets, children laughing, dogs barking. I almost turned around and left. It was too much, too loud, too alive. She paused, her fingers finding a loose thread on Robert's old sweater. But then I remembered how Robert always said that the noise of life was better than the quiet of loneliness. Officer Lee nodded encouragingly, understanding how much courage it must have taken for this grieving widow to step into such a chaotic environment. "I had Robert's photo in my wallet, the one from our 50th anniversary. I was showing my ID to donate the items when it fell out. And this little fellow," she looked down at the puppy with wonder in her eyes. "He was in a pen nearby with his siblings. The moment that photo touched the ground, he started crying and pawing at his enclosure. The shelter worker said she'd never seen him react like that to anyone." The puppy yawned, showing tiny white teeth, then snuggled deeper into Mrs. Thompson's lap. His brown fur was almost exactly the same shade as the man's hair in the photos around them. "When they let him out to meet me, he went straight to that photo. Not to me, not to the treats they offered, straight to Robert's picture. He picked it up so gently in his mouth and brought it to me." Her voice cracked slightly, just like Rex used to bring Robert his slippers every evening after work. She reached for another tissue, but this time her tears seemed different, lighter somehow, touched with joy rather than just sorrow. "The shelter staff told me his story. He was found behind an old grocery store with his siblings, no mother in sight. They'd been bottle feeding him for weeks. Said he was the quiet one, always watching people but never getting too excited when visitors came." She chuckled softly. "Until he saw Robert's photo, that is." Officer Lee watched as Mrs. Thompson pulled something from her pocket, a worn leather wallet. Inside was the photo that had started it all, a handsome older man with kind eyes and silver hair, his arm around his wife at what was clearly their 50th anniversary celebration. The puppy immediately perked up, his tail wagging as he gently nosed the picture. I filled out the adoption papers right there. The staff helped me get everything I needed: food, bowls, a little bed. One of them even drove me home since I couldn't carry it all. But when night came, she glanced at the window, where the moon was now high in the sky. He started crying. I tried putting him in his bed, but he kept dragging Robert's sweater around, whimpering. That's when I remembered how Rex used to get anxious during thunderstorms. Robert would sit up all night with him, telling him stories about their adventures together. She gestured to the photos scattered across the floor. So I thought maybe this little one needed to know his stories too. I've been sitting here for hours, showing him pictures, telling him about Robert and Rex, about the life we had and the life we might still have together. The puppy had dozed off now, his small body rising and falling with peaceful breaths. One paw still clutched a corner of Robert's sweater. The neighbors probably think I've lost my mind, Mrs. Thompson admitted, looking up at Officer Lee with worried eyes. Talking to a puppy at midnight, telling stories to a dog who can't possibly understand. But when I talk about Robert, she touched her chest, right over her heart. It doesn't hurt quite as much. For the first time since he left, I can say his name without feeling like I'm breaking apart. Officer Lee reached out, gently squeezing Mrs. Thompson's hand. In all her years on the force, she'd learned that sometimes the deepest healing came from the most unexpected sources. Here, in this room filled with memories and moonlight, she was witnessing something beautiful, the first tentative steps of a heart learning to beat fully again. As the puppy slept peacefully in Mrs. Thompson's lap, Officer Lee found herself sitting more comfortably on the carpet, her radio temporarily forgotten at her hip. The moonlight streaming through the window cast gentle shadows across the room, and something about this moment felt sacred, like a bridge between past and present, between loss and healing. You know, Lee began softly, picking up one of the fallen photographs. Your story reminds me so much of my grandmother back home. She traced the edge of the photo with her finger, remembering. She lived in a small apartment much like this one, half a world away in a busy city where the streets were always noisy with scooters and food vendors. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward slightly, her hand still rhythmically stroking the puppy's fur. Was she alone too? Lee nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. After my grandfather passed, she spent months just sitting by the window, watching life go by outside. My mother would call every day, but it wasn't the same. When you've spent 50 years waking up next to someone, sharing every meal, every moment, the silence becomes deafening. The puppy stirred slightly in his sleep, his paw twitching as he chased something in his dreams. Both women smiled at his gentle movements. "What happened to your grandmother?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. One morning, she found a cat in her garden, just a tiny thing, more fluff than actual cat. It was hurt, probably from a fight with other strays. Lee's eyes grew distant with the memory. She didn't even like cats. That was the funny thing. My grandfather had been the animal lover in the family. But something about this little creature, how it needed her. She paused, remembering the phone call from her mother. She took it to the vet, nursed it back to health. Said she was just doing it temporarily, until it was strong enough to go back outside. But that cat, Lee chuckled softly, that cat had other plans. Mrs. Thompson smiled, understanding bloomy in her eyes. They usually do, don't they? The cat, she named him Little Cloud because of his gray fur. He changed everything. Suddenly, my grandmother had someone to talk to again. Someone who needed her to get up in the morning to keep a routine. She started telling him stories about my grandfather, just like you're doing with this little guy. The puppy shifted in Mrs. Thompson's lap, letting out a tiny sigh of contentment. His paw was still wrapped around the corner of Robert's sweater, holding it close like a child with a security blanket. Little Cloud lived with her for 12 years, Lee continued, her voice thick with emotion. He was there through everything. Birthdays, holidays, the days when grief felt too heavy to bear. She talked to him for hours, showing him old photos, telling him about the life she'd shared with my grandfather. Some people thought she was crazy, talking to a cat like that. But they don't understand, Mrs. Thompson finished, wiping a tear from her cheek. They don't know how much it helps to have someone listen without trying to fix everything. Someone who just lets you remember. Lee reached out and squeezed Mrs. Thompson's hand. Little Cloud was with her until the very end. In her final days, when she was too weak to get out of bed, he never left her side. The nurses at the hospice said they'd never seen anything like it. How gentle he was with her, how he seemed to know exactly what she needed. The room fell quiet for a moment, filled only with the soft sounds of the puppy's breathing and distant city traffic. Through the window, the moon had shifted, casting new patterns on the photograph-strewn floor. My grandmother used to say that grief is really just love with nowhere to go, Lee said, watching the puppy snuffle in his sleep. But sometimes, if we're lucky, we find new ways to let that love flow again. Different shapes, different forms, but still love. Mrs. Thompson looked down at the sleeping puppy, then at Robert's sweater, then at the photos surrounding them. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," she said softly. Do you think Robert would understand?" "About the puppy, I mean. We always said after Rex that we were done with dogs. Too old for puppies, we said." Lee smiled, remembering something else her grandmother used to say. "I think love knows no age, Mrs. Thompson, and from everything you've told me about Robert, from all these photos and memories, I think he'd be overjoyed to know you found someone to share your stories with. Someone to keep your heart warm until you see him again." The puppy chose that moment to wake up, yawning widely and looking between the two women with sleepy eyes. His tail began to wag slowly as he noticed they were both watching him, and he stretched out his paw to touch Mrs. Thompson's face, just as he had done with Robert's photo at the shelter. In that simple gesture, Lee saw everything her grandmother had taught her about healing, that it doesn't mean forgetting, that new love doesn't diminish old love, and that sometimes the best medicine for a broken heart comes with 4 paws and an endless capacity for listening to the same stories over and over again, as if hearing them for the first time. Instead of writing up a noise complaint that night, Officer Lee spent the next hour helping Mrs. Thompson puppy-proof the apartment. Together, they cleared away anything that curious puppy teeth might find tempting, and Lee showed her how to create a cozy sleeping area using Robert's sweater as a comfort item. "The familiar scent will help him feel secure," Lee explained, arranging the sweater in the puppy's new bed. "And look, he can still see your bed from here. That's important for puppies in a new home." What happened next spread through the Pine Grove apartments like a wave of warmth, touching hearts and bringing together a community that had grown distant in recent years. Officer Lee didn't just file her report and move on, she saw an opportunity to make a real difference. The next morning, she stopped by the local pet store before her shift ended. The store owner, hearing Mrs. Thompson's story, donated a bag of puppy food and some basic supplies. "My wife and I lost our dog last year," he said, his eyes misty. "Sometimes the best healing comes with a wagging tail." Word spread through the police department too. Officer Wilson, who had waited patiently in the lobby that night, mentioned it to his wife who worked at the veterinary clinic. Before long, the clinic offered to provide the puppy's first checkup free of charge. "Every new beginning deserves a healthy start," the vet said with a warm smile. But it was retired Officer Morris who made perhaps the biggest difference. After 30 years as a K9 handler, he knew exactly what a new puppy owner needed, especially one who hadn't had a dog in decades. "Let me help," he insisted when Lee told him about Mrs. Thompson. "Training a puppy is like riding a bicycle. You never forget how, but sometimes you need someone to hold the handlebars for a bit." Twice a week, Morris would visit Mrs. Thompson and her puppy, who she had named Charlie. The name came to her one morning when she found him sitting by the window, watching the sunrise, just as Robert used to do during his morning coffee ritual. Robert always said the best way to start a day was to watch Charlie's angels. That's what he called the sun's rays coming through the clouds, she explained to Lee during one of her regular check-ins. The training sessions with Morris became something of a community event. Other residents would gather in the small courtyard behind the building, bringing their own pets or just coming to watch and chat. Mrs. Peters from Unit 1 started bringing homemade cookies. The young couple from 2 City offered to walk Charlie when Mrs. Thompson's arthritis acted up. Even the teenage boys, who usually kept to themselves, started stopping by to throw a ball for the energetic puppy. "It's like the whole building is coming back to life," Mrs. Peters told Lee one evening. "We used to be like this years ago when Robert would organize the holiday gatherings. Somehow this little dog is bringing that spirit back." Charlie grew quickly, but his gentle nature never changed. He seemed to know exactly who needed comfort on any given day. He would lay his head on Mrs. Thompson's lap when she had her quiet moments of grief. He would wag his tail extra hard when the children from the third floor came to visit. And somehow, he always knew when Officer Lee was approaching the building, sitting by the window and waiting to greet her with excited barks. The noise complaints stopped, replaced by something much more valuable, the sounds of life and healing. The scratching that had once worried neighbors became the happy patter of paws running to greet visitors. The whimpers turned into playful barks during training sessions, and most importantly, Mrs. Thompson's apartment was no longer silent. 6 months after that memorable night, Lee sat in Mrs. Thompson's living room, enjoying a cup of tea. Charlie lay at their feet, his head resting on Robert's old sweater, which had become his favorite toy. The walls, once bare, now held new photos alongside the old ones. Charlie's first training session, the community barbecue where he charmed everyone with his tricks, the day he graduated from basic obedience class. "You know," Mrs. Thompson said, watching Charlie sleep, "I used to think I was waiting to see Robert again. But now I understand. He never really left. He's in every kindness this community shows, in every person who stops to help, in every moment Charlie reminds me how to love again." Lee looked around the room, remembering that first night when all she'd found was darkness and grief. Now sunlight streamed through open curtains, fresh flowers sat on the coffee table, and the sound of children playing with their dogs drifted up from the courtyard below. Sometimes, Lee said, thinking of her grandmother and little Cloud, the best police work isn't about enforcing laws at all. It's about being there when hearts need healing, when communities need connecting, when love needs a new place to grow. Charlie lifted his head at her voice, his tail thumping against the floor. He still carried Robert's sweater everywhere, but now it wasn't just a source of comfort. It was a bridge between past and future, between grief and joy, between loneliness and community. And every morning, as the sun's rays, Charlie's angels, streamed through the window of Unit 4B, they illuminated not just a woman and her do,